Welcome back. We now shift to a new geographic region, the Western Mediterranean, and to a new culture, the Romans, or as they called themselves, the people of the toga. Over the next 5 lectures, rather than jumping around from culture to culture, we'll stay with the Romans, and we'll trace the rise of Roman civilization from its beginnings as a kind of grubby cluster of mud huts alongside the Tiber River, up until the time when they're a vast and powerful empire that stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia. As always, when embarking on a new region though, first I need to make a couple comments about its particular geography. The Italian peninsula, with its very distinctive boot shape, stretches north-south for about 750 miles, and it's surrounded on all sides by water, except up to the north. In fact, Italy has more miles of coastline than any European country except for Greece. There's 2 mountain chains that will play significant roles in the development of the people who live in Italy. First of all, across that northern barrier is the Alps, and these are tall, formidable mountains, and effectively they form a wall which separates Italy from the rest of Europe. There are a couple passes through the Alps, but they're very difficult to traverse, and so, pretty much like Egypt, Italy has very strong natural boundaries, and for a while, those boundaries will insulate and protect it from foreign invasion. Second, there's the Apennine Mountains, and this is a chain that runs north-south almost the entire length of the Italian peninsula. You can think of the Apennines as like a spine running down Italy. And unlike the Alps, they are not high. There's lots of places you can cross over them. But they and their surrounding foothills ensure that the center of the Italian peninsula is composed of hilly terrain. And what that means in practical terms is that all the good farmland, all the flatlands, are only found along the coasts of Italy. Now, below Italy, and between it and Africa, is the crucial island of Sicily. And remember, both southern Italy and Sicily had been heavily settled by Greek colonists, so that's a Greek region. And compared to the rest of Italy, to northern and central Italy, those areas are richer, more powerful, and more culturally sophisticated. When we turn to the city of Rome, it's located about roughly 15 miles inland from the sea, and it's located at the very first natural ford across the Tiber River. And so Rome occupies a key transportation node. Now, the site of Rome is roughly in the middle of the Italian peninsula, and Italy is roughly in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So, by an accident of geography, Rome is ideally situated in a central location to expand and dominate first Italy, and then the entire Mediterranean. The traditional date for the foundation of the city of Rome is April 21st, 753 BC. And that's actually the starting point for the Roman calendar, which counts years since the foundation of the city. And subsequent Roman history is very nicely divided up into 3 distinct periods by the form of government. First of all, we have the monarchy, when Rome was ruled by kings, and that goes from the foundation at 753 down to 509 BC. Next, you have the period of the Republic, when Rome had a somewhat democratic form of government. And that goes from 509 BC to 31 BC. And finally, the last period of Roman history is the Empire, during which, as the name implies, Rome was ruled by emperors. And that last period begins in 31 BC, and it goes for at least 400 years. The exact date of when it ends is something that scholars debate about, and is a question we'll look at later in this course. Despite the enormous importance that the Romans attached to the foundation of their city, and all the many stories that they later told about the origins of their city, it's very hard for scholars to determine the truth of those stories. There are no contemporary surviving accounts. and the accounts that we do have are quite honestly propagandistic. Archaeological, physical evidence can tell us that the site of Rome was inhabited from at least around 1000 BC. There's some graves that go back that far. Now, the most famous of all the foundation legends states that the city of Rome was established by twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were supposedly the offspring of the god of war, Mars. Through a complex series of circumstances, they were abandoned as babies and then were supposedly rescued by a friendly she-wolf, which was actually aided by a helpful woodpecker. Often the woodpecker gets left out of that story, and both of those are animals associated with the god Mars. As adults, Romulus and Remus decided to return to the spot where the wolf had found them and to found a city. But immediately they got into an argument over who should be the king of the new city. The result of that argument was that Romulus claimed the throne by murdering his brother Remus. And then he names the new city after himself. This is an odd choice for a foundation story, because it features at its core a fratricide. That's the event that begins Roman history. But in a sense, it's an entirely appropriate story, because much of Roman history will indeed consist of ambitious men fighting one another to see who will control Rome. Now, keep in mind that at this time, back at the beginning of Roman history, Rome was just a tiny, insignificant little village of thatched huts. And it was only one of hundreds of other such little villages scattered all throughout Italy. There was, however, already at that time an extensive, powerful, and sophisticated civilization which dominated the northern half of the Italian peninsula. This was the Etruscans. And early in their history, Rome fell under the control of the Etruscans. And in fact, of the 7 legendary kings of Rome, about half of them have names which are Etruscan names. So it looks like they were actually Etruscan kings imposed on Rome. So Rome goes through a period when it's ruled by foreign kings. And this experience is going to leave long-lasting psychological scars on the Romans. And in particular, it deeply ingrained in them a distrust of any one man, such as a king, holding supreme power in the state. It also made the Romans a little bit paranoid about being controlled by any foreigners. And we'll see those two themes pop up repeatedly throughout the rest of Roman history. The Etruscans themselves are a little bit of a mystery people. No Etruscan history survived to tell us their own story in their own words, and so we really only know them through the writings of their enemies, and from some archaeological evidence. 2 of the most important Etruscan cities were Cerveteri and Tarquinia, and you can still visit those today. And at those sites, there's very few buildings, but what you do have are lots of tombs underground. And the walls of those tombs are covered with absolutely spectacular wall paintings. Despite their resentment of Etruscan domination, the Romans end up copying a lot of things from them. And a number of aspects of Roman civilization that, at least in popular perception, are thought of as being distinctively Roman, in reality are actually derived from the Etruscans. And I'll give you 2 notable examples of such borrowings. The first is the toga, which was the mark of a Roman citizen, and only a Roman citizen by law could wear the toga. The toga was actually stolen from the Etruscans. It was the traditional outfit worn by Etruscan kings. A second thing that the Romans stole or borrowed from the Etruscans are gladiator games. Those actually originated as part of funeral rites for dead Etruscan leaders. And a lot of aspects of Etruscan culture, particularly religion, found their way into Roman culture, including things such as the style of temple architecture and the practice of divination, attempting to tell the future by examining the internal organs of animals. And that's a habit which we've already seen, for example, among the ancient Mesopotamians. As time goes on, the Romans increasingly resent being ruled over by the Etruscans. And the seventh king of Rome was a guy named Tarquinius Superbus, which means Tarquin the Proud. And as his name suggests, he was not a very nice person. He did things like having several Roman noblemen murdered, he ignored advice from the Senate, he surrounded himself with bodyguards, and in general, he fit the model of an arrogant tyrant. Well, in 509 BC, one of Tarquin's relatives raped a woman named Lucretia, who was the wife of a Roman nobleman. She subsequently committed suicide. But this outrage sparked a rebellion against the Tarquins, and they were kicked out of Rome. The leader of this uprising was a man named Brutus, and he swore a very famous oath over Lucretia's dead body. The oath of Brutus goes, "By this woman's blood and by all the gods, I will pursue and punish Tarquin and his children, and never again will I let them or any other man be king in Rome." Brutus's oath not only results in the end of the monarchy, but it also establishes a familial tradition of opposition to kings within the Brutus family that will have profound consequences 500 years down the road. And we'll see that when we get to the story of Julius Caesar. Still smoldering with resentment of the one-man rule of the kings, the Romans now set up a new form of government, the Roman Republic, in which political power is spread, at least somewhat, among the citizens. The Romans establish a hierarchy of offices, of government officials, and all of these are elected by the citizens. And so deeply opposed were the Romans to the whole idea of one man being the leader of the state, that even the highest office in the new system, the equivalent of our president, the Roman office was something called the consulship. The consulship is held not by one guy each year, but by two men who have equal power. And this is really a unique arrangement. And if those two consuls for the year are in accord with one another, it could be very effective. But as you can imagine, if they disagreed with one another, you have potential for terrible governmental gridlock. And Brutus was elected as one of the very first consuls. To make sure that no man remained permanently in office like a king, all Roman magistrates served 1-year terms. So you're in a year and then you're out. And originally, those positions could only be held by members of a hereditary aristocracy, a group who were known as the patricians, literally the fathers. But over time, that restriction will be relaxed. Once someone had held any one of those posts in the government, then you automatically became a member of the Roman Senate for the rest of your life. And because the Senate was made up of the most distinguished men in Rome, the opinions of the Roman Senate, even when they were not legally binding, tended to carry enormous weight. Now, there was also one more magistracy which was added a little bit later, and this gets tacked on as a result of resentment that the patricians were monopolizing and sometimes abusing power. And this final office was called the Tribune of the Plebs, and it was a special office charged with defending the rights of non-patricians. And to accomplish this, the tribunes had the veto power. They could veto anything that they thought was unfair. They also had the power to propose new laws. The ambition of every Roman patrician was to move up that ladder of offices. And this was a thing known as the cursus honorum, literally the course of honor. And Rome was an intensely competitive society. The Romans were just constantly comparing themselves with their peers, vying with their peers for prestige. And this competition for status is absolutely crucial to understanding Roman history. And the whole idea of it is best expressed by a Latin word for which there really isn't an equivalent in English. And that word is dignitas. Dignitas could be translated as status, prestige, notoriety, fame, celebrity, reputation, or clout. But it's really all of those things rolled up together in one. Your dignitas is the intangible sum of your importance. It's not just your influence, but it's a measure of how much of a big shot you are, how much people are talking about you, how much you're in the public eye. And the ways by which you could gain dignitas are infinite. You could gain dignitas if you're elected to an office, if you won a military victory, if you built a new building for the city. If you were simply rich, you had a certain amount of dignitas. If you won a high-profile law case, if you gave a good speech, if you married into a famous family, all of these things could give you dignitas. Lots and lots of different acts could gain you dignitas. The problem with dignitas is that it's fleeting, so you're constantly losing it as well. And you always have to be renewing your dignitas. So think about the concept of celebrityhood today. It's like that. The person that everybody is talking about this week, next week is forgotten unless they've done something new to put themselves back in the public eye. That's like dignitas. Also, dignitas was a zero-sum game, meaning that if you gain some, probably somebody else had to lose some. Dignitas is public, it's competitive, and it is the most important thing to a Roman aristocrat. It's more important to them than life itself. And the quest for dignitas is the engine that motivated and drove much of Roman behavior and history. All right, that's a quick outline of some of the main institutions of the Roman Republic. And all of this didn't just spring into being overnight in 509 BC. It took a couple centuries for this whole system to develop. But everything is pretty much in place by the end of the 4th century BC. So next, let's look at how Rome goes from being one of hundreds of little Italic cities to being the dominant power in all of Italy. And this was a long, gradual process. It lasts all the way from the foundation of the Republic down to about 250 BC, so about 2 or 3 centuries. And during this period, Rome is almost constantly at war with one or more of its neighbors. And in the end, Rome tends to emerge successful from these wars, but they're often difficult with many setbacks. Rome often has to fight the same enemy multiple times before they manage to subdue them. If we look first up to the north, Etruscan power by this time is fading away. And so the Romans are able to encroach in upon this territory and eventually claim all of it for themselves. In central Italy, Rome's immediate neighbors were a group of cities called the Latin League. And Rome had made a treaty with the Latin League in which Rome and the League were on equal footing, and they agreed to act as allies and to help one another. Together with the League, Rome fights many battles against mountain tribes and eventually defeats them. But once this was done, Rome then turns against its former allies in the Latin League and attacks them, and one by one conquers the cities of the Latin League. The Latin League cities are all very similar in culture and language and habits to the Romans, and so they're easily assimilated. Down to the south was another powerful federation of cities, and these were known as the Samnites. The Romans fought 3 major wars against the Samnites, and in these wars they suffered some very humiliating defeats. But eventually they subdue the Samnites and they take over their territory too. One interesting side effect of the Samnite campaigns was that in order to facilitate moving troops rapidly south, the consuls began building for the first time the Great Roman Road System, which eventually is going to link up Rome with all corners of its empire. Roman roads are really marvels of engineering. Some of them are still in use today, 2,000 years later. And that first main north-south road going down from Rome is called the Appian Way, and it was named after the consul Appius who built it. In addition to their practical purposes, These roads had an important symbolic value. Wherever the Romans go, and in this way they're almost like an animal, the Romans mark their territory. And the way they mark their territory is by building roads. And so those roads become visible symbols of Roman domination. Throughout this whole process of unifying Italy under their control, the Romans had a very unusual way of treating the people that they conquered. Now, the normal procedure in the ancient world when two cities go to war is that the defeated city would tend to be sacked, burnt down often, and its inhabitants would be killed or sold into slavery. But the Romans adopt a different strategy. Sometimes, rather than killing and enslaving the local inhabitants, the Romans would grant them full Roman citizenship. Sometimes they would do this just to the aristocracy of the city. Occasionally, entire cities were given Roman citizenship. More commonly, the Romans would give these cities something called half citizenship, which meant that they had the private rights of citizens, such as legal protections, but not the public rights, such as voting. A third thing the Romans would sometimes do is after they conquered a city, they would declare it a socius, and that meant an ally of Rome. But in all these cases, whether they were made full citizens, half citizens, or allies, the one universal obligation imposed by the Romans on the conquered Italic people was that they had to provide soldiers to the Roman army. So they didn't require taxes, but they required everybody to provide men for the Roman army. And making this the main obligation of the cities they conquered gave Rome unlimited manpower to draw upon. And those men who went off and served with the Roman army, they also then became Romanized. They would learn Latin if they didn't know it already. They would pick up Roman customs. They would start to see themselves as Romans. And so through this process, Rome Romanized the rest of the Italians, and the Latin language became the common language of the entire Italian peninsula. Rome could be a generous overlord, this idea of sharing citizenship, but they could also be cruel, particularly if a city to which they had given privileges then revolted against them. In these cases, they would move in, stomp on the city, raze it to the ground, and enslave or kill the entire populace. And it's important to stress that in all of these wars, Rome really did not have any special superiority in terms of their tactics, their leadership, or their equipment. They often suffered terrible defeats. But the Romans did have a sort of dogged persistence in the way that no matter how many times they got defeated, they would just keep coming back, and they would never give up until they won the war, no matter how severe the setbacks. During this period, the Romans also became accustomed to the idea that being at war was a normal condition. Now, today we like to think of peace as the normative state for nations, and wars are exceptional interruptions. But for the Romans, it's just the opposite. For example, during about a 200-year stretch from the mid-4th century down through the 2nd century BC, there were only 10 years approximately during which Rome was not at war with someone. One historian once noted that the Romans displayed an almost biological imperative to go out and inflict massive violence on somebody every year. In later years, the Romans would tell lots of stories about heroes and courageous figures from this era. And sometimes it's hard to separate out fact from fiction. But the qualities which are displayed by these early heroes of Roman history become identified as the set of characteristics that the Romans like to believe defined them as a people. One example of such an early hero was a guy named Mucius. Now, in his story, Rome was being attacked by the Etruscans, and the Etruscan king and his army have surrounded the city. In order to save Rome, Mucius volunteered to sneak into the enemy headquarters and to assassinate the Etruscan king. Now, Mucius succeeded in infiltrating the camp, but then he killed the wrong person and he gets captured. The Etruscan king decides that he'll torture Mucius with fire, and so he has a blazing urn brought into the room. But rather than being intimidated by this threat, Mucius looked him straight in the face and very boldly made a famous declaration. Mucius said, "I am a Roman citizen. My name is Gaius Mucius. I came here to kill my enemy, and I'm not afraid to die. Watch me and learn how unimportant the body is to those who have dedicated themselves to a greater cause." Mucius then thrust his right hand into the flames, and he held it there, showing absolutely no emotion, while the flesh literally crisped up and burnt off his bones. Upon seeing this, the king was so astonished, or maybe frightened, that immediately he just released Mucius, let him go, and he ended the war. I think wisely preferring not to fight against a nation of such fanatical opponents. To honor and commemorate this deed, the Romans gave Mucius a new surname, and this was a name that would be passed down to all of his descendants. So he became Mucius Scaevola, which loosely translates as Mucius the Lefty, because he no longer had a right hand. In this episode, Mucius displays not only obviously bravery, but ingenuity and the stereotypical Roman determination never to give up. The benefits of Rome's policy of incorporating captured states and the sort of unwavering determination that we just saw with Mucius can both clearly be seen in the last set of wars that Rome fights in this period. And these are wars against the wealthy Greek cities in southern Italy. The most powerful of those cities was a place called Tarentum. And when the inevitable war with the Romans broke out in 280 BC, Tarentum used its wealth to go hire the best mercenaries in the world to protect itself. So the Tarentines went to the mainland of Greece, and they hired a mercenary general, a guy named Pyrrhus of Epirus. And Pyrrhus had delusions of being a second Alexander the Great. He wasn't that good, but he was a very good soldier. Pyrrhus arrived in Italy with an army of 30,000 professional combat-hardened Greek mercenaries, and he even had 20 war elephants. He fights a battle with the Romans. And in that battle, the Romans fight hard, but compared to Pyrrhus and his professionals, they're outclassed. So the Romans are wiped out. Although they did manage to inflict heavy casualties on Pyrrhus's army. Now, in the Hellenistic world, the normal procedure at this point would have been to exchange some envoys, sign a peace treaty, and probably Rome would pay a big fine. But the Romans do something odd here. They refuse to negotiate, and instead they go back to their reserves of Italian manpower and they raise a second army. And they send this new army down against Pyrrhus. And in really an exact repeat of the first battle, the Romans fight hard, but they're soundly defeated. Once again, though, they manage to kill a good number of Pyrrhus's troops. And after this battle, Pyrrhus famously commented, "One more victory like this, and I'm done for." And it's from that kind of a costly military triumph, where you win but really in some sense lose, that today we get the phrase a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhus must have imagined that after crushing the Romans twice, that would be the end of the war, and the Romans would finally negotiate. But instead, the Romans go back to the Italians, they summon their reserves, they muster a new army, and they send it south. And at this point, Pyrrhus simply gave up. He took the remnants of his force and he fled back to Greece. So he won all the battles, but he lost the war. And his final reaction to this whole experience was to compare fighting the Romans to fighting a hydra. And those of you familiar with Greek mythology will know that a hydra is a mythological monster that when you chop off one of its heads, two more grow in its place. Well, with Pyrrhus out of the way, Rome moves into southern Italy and brings all of that area under its control. And by 264 BC, Rome had conquered the entire Italian peninsula. And now they could draw on the resources and the manpower of all of Italy. It's been estimated that this was about 3 million people, of whom about 1 million possessed some kind or version of citizenship. And the population of Rome itself had swollen to about 150,000. The stage was now set for Rome to begin thinking about crossing the seas and expanding outside of Italy. The conquest of Italy had been helped by the fact that most of the other people who lived there were similar to the Romans in culture and language. But in the next lecture, we'll see what happens when Rome moves outside of Italy and encounters civilizations and people who are truly different from them. The next lecture will also include the greatest threat that the Romans ever face. And it's a threat that nearly brings them to the brink of total destruction. Thank you.